This week on Investigating Pathways, I'm joined by Danielle Strachman. Danielle has previously founded a charter school and was the driving force behind building the Thiel Fellowship. Most recently, Danielle has been working with young founders who work outside tract institutions by investing in early-stage startups at the 1517 Fund, where she is a founder and general partner. Today, we talked about Danielle's journey as a founder, VC, and how she built the Thiel Fellowship from the ground up, as well as how students can now work outside of the education bubble.
Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. So I wanted to start off looking at like your origin story, right? Like back at your childhood. So could you tell me a little bit about what your childhood was like and your education, including your college experience?
Yeah, absolutely. Gosh, well, how far back do you want me to go? No, I'm just kidding. Um, I guess what would I say? Hmm. In some ways I had a very traditional sort of upbringing. Um, Went to public school, nothing fancy. I actually had a very hard time in school. I learned to read late. I wasn't particularly like academically gifted. I tried really, really hard at things, but just sort of like sitting, reading things, that was not how I learned. I really learned by doing and being participatory. And in my schooling, pretty much all the way through high school, there wasn't very much that was participatory. Although what's interesting when I look back at it is actually the areas that where there was a participatory aspect was in music, and I took a lot of music lessons as a kid, and I think that shaped a lot of how I learned and developed without me even realizing it. And even things like leadership. For example, I was in our school's band, and I always led like the clarinet section, and oh, okay, Danielle, show these people what to do. And I never thought of things like that as leadership, but they are. And I noticed I always was engaging in clubs and different things. And I always like doing, like I liked making
Yeah.
things, I liked doing things, but I never thought to myself, I don't think I questioned the system at all. And it wasn't until I was in my early 20s and started working with homeschooling families actually that I thought, oh, maybe I would have liked something like this better. And because I worked with homeschoolers, people ask me like, was I homeschooled? I'm like, no, not one bit. Um, but it wasn't even until college, and I did go to college. I had no idea what I would have done otherwise at 18. I actually remember I got into probably my like number one pick school that I wanted to go to. And I remember this weird feeling coming up though of it was like this question now of, oh, do I really want this? And I think this is something that happens a lot in people's lives where you think you want something and then you get it and then you start questioning if you really want it or not. And sometimes this comes up to, the phrase imposter syndrome is maybe even overused these days, but it's this thing that happens when you are chosen for something and then you deem that you actually were chosen by mistake, instead of that you're supposed to be there. And I didn't have that about college, but I remember saying to my mom, oh, I don't know if I want to go. And she basically said to me, like, over my dead body, are you not going to go? And also, what would you do otherwise? And, I think I had a laptop maybe in my third year of college. Like, I don't think they had really fully come out yet. So you couldn't just build something on a laptop. There weren't boot camps and things like that. So I did go to college, but it was the first time that I had the experience of being able to choose what I studied, why I studied it. Everything else before then had been very regimented, and it opened my eyes up to the idea of being able to choose your learning path. The sad part was about the school I went to that after I left, they decided to have a much more regimented program with their students and saying, oh, now you have
hmm
to take, a course from this area and this area. And I was like, oh man, like I'm really glad I got out of there before that and was able to just choose and have more agency. I think that was a really important part in my sort of like learning career, was that agency was really important, and it wasn't something on offer until later on.
Gotcha. So now I want to move towards the founding of Innovations Academy. And so, first and foremost, what got you into the educational space to begin with?
Yeah, so to begin with, I always, going back to childhood for a second, I always loved playing school and, playing the role of teacher and things like that. But everyone told me when I was growing up, like those who can't teach, the pay is terrible. There's no respect. The hours are long. Like everybody was basically telling me, don't become an educator, which actually kind of worked out in some ways because I ended up going in a very different direction. I thought I was going to be in clinical neuropsych and working with patients, which I did for a short time, not as a clinician, but as sort of a tech. And I decided that if growing up meant having to do a job that I wasn't like super passionate about, then I didn't want to go down that path. And so I started a tutoring company after I had finished college. This was back in 2003. Is that 2003? Yeah, I think, yeah, about 2003, started my tutoring company. I had always loved tutoring before that. I had done it on the side. I had taught music lessons. I had taught math. I would kind of just do whatever anybody needed. And I found that I had a really good aptitude, even for subjects that I wasn't good at, for just brushing up on whatever I needed, for a lesson that day and being able to go through it with a student. And I'm very good at explaining things. I think one of the things that you and I have talked about is when you're trying to get learnings about a topic, sometimes it's hard to figure out where to go. And I've been told many times by people in the venture community, they're like, wow, you really fleshed that all the way out for me. And I think that's just a skill I've had for a long time and is part of that love of teaching for me. But but yeah, I started a tutoring company in 2003, and by sort of a random series of events, mostly through A/B testing ads on Craigslist, I got to work with homeschooled students. This is before Craigslist was creepy and weird to use. Um, and I was testing out ads on there. I didn't know what A/B testing was, but both my parents are entrepreneurial, and so I said, "Oh, well, I know if I post different ads, I can sort of see, what traction." And I was not using the word traction. I was like, "Oh, just see what happens." But I had a homeschooling family reach out to me, which was sort of a godsend because when you're a tutor, most of the business is in the afternoon, and so then you have to find ways to fill your mornings with other work. And this homeschooling family reached out to me. They were very religious. After that, I mostly worked with secular homeschoolers because I found a niche with that group. But I loved working with them. They were so different. And even though our sort of religious spiritual views were different, it was so thrilling to go over to their house, and their children were so excited to see me. They were like, yay, you're here. Can we learn math and science? And can we write a paper? And can you stay for 2 more hours today? Whereas when I went over a public or private school student's house, it was more like I was helping to put a band-aid on a bullet wound. They were like, oh, you're here. I need to do this homework that sucks. Can you help me with it? Oh, I'm 4 years behind in math and I need to try to catch up in 2 weeks. And it was like, oh my God, like this is no bueno. This is just plain bad. So I loved working with the homeschoolers, and it was from working with that group that I started working with a homeschool co-op started by a woman named Christine Kuglin. We worked together for multiple years on this co-op. We had a great time. And one day she came to me and she said, hey, I've been thinking about, I'm using all this like startup terminology that like we didn't have then, but she's like, I'm thinking about scaling the co-op, because we had maybe 20 families in the co-op, and there would be other families that would come and say, oh, I'd love to join the co-op, but like we don't have somebody who can come and do the homeschooling portion and participate. What do I do? So she said, maybe there's a way we can scale this co-op by starting a school. And at first I told her, I was like, you're crazy. We don't like school. Why would we start a school? Like, this is nuts. But she had this vision that there was really a hole in the market for people wanting to learn in a different way. And she was right. She'd gone to High Tech High's sort of, what do they call that? It's kind of just like, hey, come learn about admissions. And High Tech High is one of the most premier charter schools in the country. They were fairly new at the time, though, still. And even then, they were, on their admissions meetings, there would be hundreds of parents in the audience. And she went to one, and this one parent got up at the meeting and said, you have 20 spots for kindergarten and I have a 7th grader. Where's my kid going to go to school? Like, and apparently there was this, I wish I'd been there. There's this like huge uproar in the audience, people being like, yeah, where's my kid going to go to school? And, High Tech High didn't have enough spots for all the demand. And that's when my colleague was like, we got to do this. This is really needed. There's a demand in the market for other charter schools. So that's how we started Innovations Academy. It was just the two of us. We would meet at a coffee shop to start once a week to try to figure out how would we get this going. And it was a lot like a startup. We actually entered an accelerator program called Charter Launch that was run by the California Charter School Association, where they kind of taught us, here's all the steps you need to go through to build a school. Here's how to get passed through the district. Here's how to get grant funding. And then we had to do things that any sort of startup person needs to do. You need to build a team, you need to get funding. For us, we needed facilities as one of the hardest parts of running a charter school. So we needed to do that. And one day in 2008, we actually opened our doors and we had, I think, 160 students who had enrolled, and we were terrified. We were like, oh my God. We actually tried, we thought that when we were building our school as the founders, we thought we would hand it off to a bona fide principal and be like, hey, take our baby and now make it grow. You know how to run a school. And the people at the Charter Accelerator program were very smart. And they came to us and they said, no, that's not how this works. You know the vision and the mission of your school. You know what things are supposed to look like. So you need to run it. And her and I were, again, very naive. And we thought, oh, well, since we're both running it, that means we'll only work half-time each, and we'll just have this sort of nice thing we're doing. And then I'll still have my tutoring company. She'll homeschool her kids sometimes. Instead, we were both working a minimum of 80 hours a week. That our hair was on fire the whole time. But it was an amazing experience to really take homeschooling philosophy and put it in a school setting. And a lot of that for us looks like very child-led learning, a lot of project-based learning, and just respecting children as human beings and not thinking of them as lesser than. And that's been one of my sort of driving forces over time, is to offer opportunities to people that they didn't have previously, and mostly to young people. Although I often say that as I get older, my definition of a young person also gets older. So when I'm 60, I think I'll be like, those 40-year-olds, they really need this thing. So who knows? But yeah, that's how the school started. The school is still running to this day. We serve 400 students a year. We just bought a building. I've been on the charter school board for the entire time. And so I've gotten to watch lots of changes. I ran the school with my co-founder, Kristen, for the first 2 years, which was both like one of the best and most challenging things I've ever done. We went through budget cuts. We had parents who were upset with us. We had parents who were overjoyed with what we were doing. Very sort of like the startup up and down of, in the same day, you can be elated and completely depressed. And her and I would literally peel each other off the floor of the office and be like, come on, we got to keep going. We got to keep doing this. But, now things are very stable and normal. And yeah, it was an amazing sort of piece of my career journey that in some ways feels like just yesterday, but in fact was quite a while ago.
Got it. So now I'm curious, how come you decided to move on from your day-to-day aspect of working at Innovations Academy, and where'd you end up after that?
That's a great question. So yeah, from 2008 to 2010, I was co-directing with Christine, my co-founder. And what I figured out was, I figured, you learn things about yourselves or yourself when you do things. And one of the things that I learned was that when I was a private tutor and when I was running my own business, it's not that I didn't have sort of responsibilities. I had lots of responsibilities. I had to be at places at certain times and things like this, but I also had a lot of flexibility in what I was doing. And when I was a charter school director, you have to be there at the school, before it opens. You have to be there after everything else has closed out. It's very regimented. It was very hard to get that sort of flexibility back. It was also challenging because I like making people happy. And it's really hard to make an entire body of parents happy. And so we had parents who really loved what we were doing, but then we'd also have parents who came to the school because it was down the street from them and they didn't believe in the philosophy of what we had, like a very minimal thing. everybody is on a first name basis at Innovations Academy. I'm just Danielle there. I'm not Miss Strachman. I'm not Miss Danielle. I'm just Danielle. We would have parents who would come and say, well, my child is going to call you Miss Strachman because that's, that's respectable. And we were like, no, what's respectable is to call people what they want to be called. And that was a foreign concept at the time. And so we're always having to kind of push for like, hey, this is what we're doing here. And if you don't like this, there are other options of where you can go. But I think oftentimes people would hear that as, you're not listening to your customer kind of thing. And there's a point at which I think sometimes you have to say to someone, yes, we don't serve up certain things at our business. And so maybe this is not a fit from that customer perspective. But I loved it a lot, but it was also burning me out, to be very, very honest. And I knew that I wanted to, and the last part of it was that I started the school because I loved working with students. But when you become a school administrator, you don't work with students anymore. You're working with the district, you're working with parents, you're working with staff, and all that's really wonderful and was super growth promoting. I learned a ton about leadership on the fly. I made all the mistakes you can make, but I really missed that student and part and seeing the light bulb go off. And so I decided I was going to leave. It was very hard to do. Just like when a co-founder leaves a company, the parents were nervous. They were like, why are you leaving? What's going on? I had a great out though. I had a boyfriend who lived in the Bay Area at the time. And I was like, I'm leaving for love. It's not you. It's not that the whole thing is really stressful and insane. It's that there's this other thing that's really happy and bright. And they were all like, oh, yay, that's wonderful. And I was like, oh, thank God. Because I didn't want them to think like there was something wrong with the school, because there wasn't anything wrong with the school. It just wasn't a fit for me to be a school director forever. So I moved up to the Bay. I didn't have a plan for what I was going to do. I thought no one's going to value my skill sets. I don't work in tech. I don't have a hard science background. I was lost. I really didn't know exactly what I was going to do, but I did know that my vision has always been working with young people and giving them options. And 3 months into being in the Bay Area, someone called me from the Thiel Foundation and said, hey, and her exact words were, the foundation has lost their minds. They're starting this new program called the Thiel Fellowship. We give grants to young people to enable them to do science and tech projects outside of university. I think you would be perfect to run this. And I was like, oh, but still my beating heart. This is amazing. This is exactly what I want to do. And one thing I loved about it was that it gave me the opportunity to work one-on-one individually with people, those being the Thiel Fellows, but also have that big grand impact. That was something that was interesting about the charter school, where I was having a much bigger impact holistically, but I was getting very removed from the day-to-day of the student. And with the fellowship, with our fellows, I was very in the day-to-day of what they were doing, plus having the big impact. And that for me was just a winning combo. I'll pause there because you probably have specific questions about the fellowship itself. But yeah, that was how I went from school to Thiel Fellowship. That's why I ended up leaving.
Absolutely. So I know that the fellowship, like the name of it initially was the 20 under 20 program, right? And so could you tell me a little bit about, like, was there a difference in what 20 under 20 was doing versus what the Thiel Fellowship in its current state is doing right now?
Man, you have great questions. You are asking better questions than many other podcasters I've been with. You've like done your homework. You're like, you're right in there. So yes, you are absolutely correct. It used to be called 20 under 20. And the idea was that we would select about 20 people a year who were under the age of 20, which means they were literally 19 and under when they applied to work on a science and tech project outside of university, outside of other work. And we often use the word projects because we didn't know where things were going to go. And back in 2010, when the Thiel Fellowship launched, I mean, it was blasphemous. Like the idea that you would take time off university as a teenager or someone in their early 20s to work on something in this sort of renegade rogue fashion. People were incensed by what we were doing. And so it was also very hard to find applicants. Our first year of applications, we only had 400 applicants. And I know now the fellowship gets, I think something like 10,000 plus applicants. So it's grown a lot. But in that first year, what we were saying is, hey, do you want to work on something? It could be a science or tech project. It could be a nonprofit. It could be a startup. We weren't entirely sure where these things were going to go. And what we were assessing people on was we were sort of looking at what was their past history of execution, what sort of big ideas do they have, and do we think they have the potential to meet those ideas? And so 20 under 20 um, was 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 wild, to be honest. I mean, we were taking people who wanted to do asteroid mining, people who wanted to do startups, people who wanted to do nonprofits, people who wanted to do mathematics research. And that was just the first year of Thiel Fellows. That's not like a whole span of people. That's just the first year. And even in the first year, actually, Laura Deming, she really surprised us. She had been admitted. This is one of those things I was talking about earlier, where when sometimes you get something, you think about it differently afterwards. This happened for all the Thiel Fellows, where I would say most of them went through an early quarter life crisis, where they were like, oh, wow, I have 2 years, I have $100,000, I have the support of this organization. I think a lot of them also felt pressure in terms of like, I'm an inaugural Thiel Fellow and I want to like set an example for future people who are coming through. And a lot of them were very much sort of, put in the news and things like that as these figureheads of, hey, look, young people are doing interesting things. And so, that's a lot of responsibility to live up to. And so often people would get a Thiel Fellowship and then really like they'd like do a total left turn. And Laura Deming's included in this, where she originally was coming in to work on longevity research, but she came in. She was under 18 at the time. I think she was 17, maybe even 16, and she said, "Hey, I don't think the gap is in longevity research. I think the gap is in funding for longevity work. So I want to start a venture capital fund to fund companies that work in longevity." And we were like, hold on, back the bus up. We're the program that tells people they can stop and like do crazy things and be risk taking because they're young and they don't have like a wife and kids and all this kind of stuff. And then Laura came to us with what she wanted to do, and we were like, I guess we have to support her in this and say yes. And so she started a venture capital fund before she was even 18 years old. She's been very successful. She has a second fund now. I wouldn't be surprised if she's raising her third fund soon, for any LPs potentially listening. But yeah, it was a really wild program. So to answer your question, it was very different than the program it is today. Today, a lot more people know about the fellowship. It's not called 20 under 20 anymore. It's called the Thiel Fellowship. And I think we renamed it that in year 2 or 3. I don't remember exactly why the name change happened. There was an age change that happened about 5 years ago, right when myself and Michael were departing, where we said, hey, one of our theses on 20 under 20 was that people probably wouldn't want to take the leap to do something different if they already had accrued student debt. But the fact is that that wasn't true. What we found was that people said, even at the age of 20, 21, 22, hey, I want to make this leap and do it, even though I have this debt attached. I think that makes it even harder to know that, oh, I'm walking away with 50, 100, 150, 200K in debt, and I want to do a startup. Like when I was starting my tutoring company, I had 10,000 in student debt and a 2% interest rate. It was very easy to say, hey, I can start my company and not feel the burden of this. But I think it's much harder if you have debt. So the program now takes people who are a little bit older, up through age 23, I think, at this point. I'm not sure if they've changed it in like the last 6 months or not. And it is very startup focused at this point, because the fellowship gets so many applications now. They can be a little more choosy about, okay, we want people to have more traction in what they're doing and be further along. That said, I honestly miss the old days. I miss the renegade, like, let's take the crazy young person with a wild idea and not much else and see what they can do with it. My personal purview is that that's a very interesting way to spend nonprofit dollars, is to put it behind just really, really crazy, super, super early things. It's not to say that what they're doing now is wrong or anything like that. It's still early what people are working on, but like, the state that things are in for current Thiel Fellows are more like maybe they have a seed round of funding, whereas we were taking people where they barely had the idea fleshed out. So we definitely had, I think, maybe a riskier, crazier mentality. And in part, that was driven by that it took a riskier, crazier person to take a leap of faith out of school, whereas now it's much more normalized and common.
Got it. So I think one of the most interesting parts about the 20 under 20 program is I've read the launch was like wild, right? Everyone hated on it. Could you tell me a little bit about that?
Yeah, no, it was so wild. I remember I was terrified actually. I had, done a little media training, not very much at all, and then all of a sudden it was like, hey, we need a quote for this, we need a quote for that. We worked with the PR team to launch it, and they told us that at most in a press cycle, you get 2 weeks of press. And we went on for something like 7 weeks of press. Like it was just nonstop. People wanted to interview fellows. People wanted to interview us. People wanted to understand this notion of what is the higher education bubble. People wanted to hear Peter speak about it. Um, I remember I was doing a report, I think that year or the next year, and I was looking at like different stats of like, hey, how do we know that we're sort of making a dent in the universe? And one of those was looking at Google Analytics of like, okay, how is the term education bubble searched? And before fellowship it was like, it's like dead in the water. Fellowship hits, it's this huge spike, and then it kind of dipped back down again, like on a more normal level. But it was just interesting to see that people were talking about college in a way that no one had ever talked about before. Peter was really holding up a sign that I think people had been feeling the pressure of for a long time of, wow, this is really expensive. We're not sure what people are getting out of this, but he loves to get people to talk about things, even when, and he, I think, sometimes really likes when people think he's wrong. I mean, it really means you've hit a nerve on something. And so yeah, it was very interesting. It was very intense. It was also very intense because we didn't expect press and news to focus on individual Thiel fellows themselves. We kind of thought, oh, like the fellows will be sort of sheltered from that, and they'll focus, like people will focus on the program. But it was interesting. I mean, people had vitriolic hatred of certain Thiel fellows. Like I think Dale Stevens in particular got a lot of shade from lots of people. He was starting Uncollege and very outspoken and actually very good at the press piece. And people would come out of the woodwork and attack him. And we were like, you're attacking a 19-year-old who's like just trying to make different options for people who got a grant. Like, really? But there's something that happens in media where people will see a train that is leaving the station and say, wow, that train's on fire. I'm going to jump on that train. We call them train jumpers. And even though they are not really adding to the conversation, they're just making controversy, which kind of stirs things up and helps their reputation to build and so on. So it was a lot of learnings on the PR media side as well. But it was interesting because one of our goals was with the fellowship was to make the notion of leaving or not going to college normal. And one of the goals that we set out was that people wouldn't even say Peter's name when they were talking about the education bubble, or that the fellowship would never even be mentioned in this context. And now it's completely normal. Like it was even 5 years in, people would talk about it in the news and the fellowship would never be mentioned. And it was interesting too, because we got to see a lot of boot camp programs and hackathons and all these different things that kind of started launching. And I think the fellowship really made it acceptable for these other programs to start. And, I'm not saying that those programs should be like, oh, the fellowship helped me to do this or that or the other thing, but I really think we paved the way for a whole set of new conversations and new opportunities to come up in the education space.
Got it. And so following off of that, I'm curious, what is like the highlight of your experience with the Thiel Fellowship, right? What was the best part about building it?
The best part of building it. That's interesting. Well, I mean, I think to go back to what I said earlier, I love having both the big impact and getting to work with the individual people. So that was great. Like I will never forget, for our first year of Thiel Fellows, everything was a first. Like, the first set of retreats we did with them. We had something kind of like a graduation for them after the 2 years of, having them talk about like what we always said about the program was that it was a 2-year program with a 10-year timeline. So it was tough because people would say like, well, what have these people done in 2 years that's so magnificent? And it's like, they've gotten started on the really big things that take 10 years to build. And now we can actually put those things down and say, yeah, like, look at what Laura's done. Look at what Vitalik Buterin did with Ethereum. Look at what's happening right now with Austin Russell, with Luminar. But all those things take a really, really long time. And so for me, I think the most gratifying thing is really seeing the development of the individual people themselves and being able to say, yeah, I knew that person when they were 17 years old. Like, that's insanity to me. And now watching what they're doing, influencing the world at large at a very young age. So actually, I feel very much like I'm still getting sort of the benefit of the outcomes of the program, just getting to watch what happened by starting something really new and different. And even things like, even in my own family, I have cousins who are a lot younger than I am. And it's totally acceptable now to go to a trade high school. When I was in high school, if you went to trade high school, it meant you were dumb, like hands down. It didn't, it was not good. Um, and now it's like, oh yeah, you want to be a plumber? Cool. You're learning a real skill and you're going to make money. Like, that's great. So just being able to see the conversation across not only the world, but even in my own family change is really interesting. But there's so many fun memories. Like, we would, a favorite pastime of us with the fellowship was to play the game Werewolf, sometimes called Mafia. We would get together on these retreats and play. And Thiel Fellows are brutal at that game, just plain brutal. And actually, we had a great time recently where we did a 10-year reunion with the first class of fellows, and we got them all on Zoom, or those who would come anyways. And it was just great to hear from people about what they were doing and their lessons learned. And a lot of them are just starting to turn 30. And it's just, yeah, just kind of amazing to see what's happening. And I think those dividends will keep adding over time. So I'm just really excited to see, what continues to happen with fellows and what they've built.
Got it. So now I'm curious, how come you decided to move away from working on the Thiel Fellowship full time, and what drew you to venture capital to build 1517?
Yeah, no, great question. Had someone told me 10 years ago that I'd be in VC, I would have said, what's VC? I didn't know anything about the industry. And what really drove me to it was opportunity. 5 years into the Thiel Fellowship, myself and my colleague Michael Gibson were starting to see the outcomes of sort of the foundation we had laid with the fellowship in terms of what people were building, what they were making, who was getting investment. People like Dylan Field with Figma were really starting to take off even 5 years ago. And of course, it's even greater now. And one of the things that we saw was that with the fellowship, we were giving a grant and we could support the individual fellow, but we weren't supporting the company. Like, when we had a review, it was with the individual fellow. It was not with the company. And so I think that individual focus was really good for a grant program to have. But what we saw was that when Thiel Fellows were going out there to raise money, and it's still this way for a lot of young people, whether they're a fellow or in a program or not, is that in the venture capital world, they're not necessarily taken that seriously. They might be seen as like someone to scout for, maybe someone who would make an exceptional intern at another portfolio company, but not necessarily someone to actually back. And so we said, hey, we know sort of all these pockets, whether the fellowship and other programs where young people reside who we think are really talented, who we would want to back. And one thing that's beautiful about having a venture capital fund is that you can keep backing people. We don't have to say we're one and done and we'll never back you again. In fact, we've recently backed founders that we backed in Fund 1, now in Fund 2. And it's really great to be like, yeah, let's go again. Let's do this. Whereas with the fellowship, if we gave someone a grant, it was a one-time thing and that was it. Mm-hmm. And so then we just said, we think there could be more opportunities here. And as we were seeing Thiel Fellows building companies that were working, I think 5 years ago, we had 8 outperforming companies in the fellowship. And we said, why are we calling up other GPs at funds and saying, hey, will you take a pitch meeting? Will you give feedback on the deck? And most GPs don't have an educational or educator bent, so they weren't interested in giving feedback on a deck. I was sometimes patted on the head and told like, oh, that's that nice little nonprofit program you have there. And I was like, look at what my nice little nonprofit program is doing. Like, and our advantage is that those people were not paying attention. So we said, hey, let's start a fund. We'll back people who don't have college degrees predominantly. We'll be one of the first checks into the company, and we'll show that support and then follow on from there. And so for us, it was really wanting to say, let's go bigger or go home with the fellowship. As great as the fellowship is, and it's still going, it still has limits on what it can do. And we thought there's another model that we could use, that being an investor, to be able to work with people over a much longer period of time, and make even more impact in what they're doing.
Got it. So I know you've written a little bit about how raising venture partners was difficult, right? So could you tell me a little bit about that process? What was it like to find and raise capital from partners?
Yeah, absolutely. So in a venture capital fund, just for those listening, yes, it's not our money. We raised money from other people to get it going. The first person that we pitched was Peter Thiel, and we weren't pitching him actually. What we were doing is 5 years ago, we had a breakfast meeting with him, and we told him about this idea to do, Fellowship 2.0 as a venture fund. And we were actually just asking for his blessing to leave the foundation. We're like, please don't be mad. Like, we love this program and working with you, but we're ready for like something new and different. And he got very excited. And again, we were not pitching him for money at all. And he said, hey, I'm going to be an anchor LP. And an anchor LP is somebody who, kind of like literally anchors your fund and says, I'm going to put in a good chunk of money here so that it shows other people that someone has conviction in what you're doing. And I remember I smiled so big at that meeting, I covered my mouth. I was like, oh my God, I can't, like, holy shit, like we're actually starting a venture fund. This is insane. So at that point we said, Michael and I turned to each other and we were like, okay, I guess we're really starting this fund now since we have a commitment. And that meant that we still needed to raise more money. And in that meeting with Peter, actually, we were talking to him and we were like, we didn't even know how much money to raise. We thought maybe we'd raise 10 million bucks. And he said, no, you should raise 20. And we said, okay, I guess we'll raise 20 million bucks. And so we hit the road after that, and we started pitching other people who might be limited partners, investors in our fund. And the way that we did it was that we were just really shameless. Like, we have a pitch deck, like, small venture funds, it's very similar to starting a company in some ways, where you have a pitch deck, you're meeting people, you're accessing your networks. I had a spreadsheet of 300 people that we emailed with the deck, and I would basically write to them and say, hey, I don't know if this is something you're interested in or have the financial capability to back, but maybe somebody who does. And actually that strategy worked really, really well. People would often make an intro and say, gosh, I really believe in what you guys are doing. I love this. I want to help, get you introduced to high net worth individuals, family offices, people who can help to fund you. And so we just pounded the pavement physically, metaphorically, and talked to hundreds and hundreds of people. We had a pretty good hit rate with the first fund, where if we got an in-person meeting with someone, there was a 50-50 chance that we would close them. But it was a very, very interesting psychological thing, because sometimes you close somebody and then like I had never thought this way in my life. I came from the nonprofit world, and I remember this one limited partner that we closed, and I think he came in for 500,000, and he agreed to it on the phone. And my first, like, for a second, I was like, yes, we closed him. Half second later, I was like, we didn't ask for enough money. It was too easy. Like, we should have asked for more, because he wasn't like grumbly at all. So that's when I knew I was no longer in the nonprofit mindset, where I was both grateful yet like perturbed with myself that, oh wait, we should have played this differently. That was a very interesting moment indeed. But that was a very interesting part of the process, was going out there, raising money from other people, sharing the vision. Raising fund one was actually very much easier than raising fund two for us. Fund one, I think people needed to make a gut decision. There were no numbers. We didn't have a track record. You just needed to believe that we had an interesting idea and we're the right people to do it. And you had to kind of just, like I said, go with your gut and either decide to write the check or not. With Fund Two, I think it was harder. In part, we closed Fund Two this last year, in part because there are a lot more pre-seed and seed funds out there in the market. And also because we have data now, people needed to think like they were both making a good gut decision, but also making a good decision of the mind of saying, oh, this mathematically makes sense. Like, these numbers on this spreadsheet are going to go somewhere good. And when we started fundraising, we were only 3 years into Fund One, which for a pre-seed fund is not very much time to show those good numbers. So those good numbers really started hitting in year like 4-ish, and then fundraising became easier. But it was much harder because people had to think that they were making a really good decision, which we want them to do. But it was harder to prove to them that they were making a good decision as an early stage fund.
Got it. So now I want to talk about one of the most interesting parts, I think, of 1517 that came up recently, which is the Invisible College, right? So to start off with, could you tell me a little bit about what the Invisible College is and where the motivation for starting it came from?
Yeah, so Invisible College started this year. It's something that we had been running before calling it anything. We just didn't have a name for it. So let me back it up a little bit. So typically we will write a $250,000 check into a team with a name. And that's what I like to say. They're not a company yet. Like they're working on becoming a company. And they usually have to have some semblance of a prototype, usually going into a couple pilots. That's where we find our founders have their feedback loops. We do not think investors are your feedback loop. Not a good idea. But there are times when people will come to us and say, gosh, I just need a little bit of money to prove out some R&D on something, or to get started. And we were doing that opportunistically in Fund One. Oftentimes it was with solo founders, often who were working on sort of like mobile social apps. And we learned the hard way that those things are really hard to build. And so we stopped doing 50K checks into those types of companies because not because like, I mean, they're hard, but also we don't like, one thing we talk about a lot is our diligence process equipped to handle something? And myself and Michael always say we are not cool people, so we don't know what other people are going to think is cool. So we're like, okay, we are not doing a good job here. But what we do know that we're good at from our fellowship days is picking people who are talented, who are articulate, and who have a mission on something they want to fulfill on that usually has like a deep tech side to it, or an R&D side to it, because that's what we were picking in Thiel Fellows. And so we pivoted to writing checks into things like a battery technology company with a 50K check to start. And then we would scaffold up and say later, maybe a year later, okay, hey, you've got some government grants now. You have a little bit more traction in terms of what you're building now. Let's do the 250K check. So then when COVID hit in the States in March, we had this huge influx of young people reaching out to us saying, hey, I don't want to go to Zoom school. I want to build a company. And we sat on it for a little while and thought about it and said, hey, wait, like we do these 50K opportunistic checks sometimes. Why don't we operationalize it, call it something? My colleague Michael is a genius at naming things. He named 1517 and he named the Invisible College. And so we thought about it, I think, on a Thursday, and we launched it on a Tuesday to say, hey, we have our Invisible College program, submit an application to us. We favor things that are more R&D level tech, and we'll help you get started. And we had a ton of applications come in from all over. And that's that program. We have a handful of startups that are our Invisible College investees or portfolio companies. And, the hope is that within about 6 months that they might be ready for our 250K check, and then we can go from there. But one thing that was really interesting about launching the Invisible College is we put it up on social, and like the crowd went positively wild for it. So instead of, it was like this huge change 10 years later from the fellowship of during the fellowship, we were called the most misguided piece of philanthropy by Larry Summers. And then 10 years later, everybody and their brother is like, this is amazing. This is so needed. Zoom school is so expensive. This is so great that you guys are doing this. And it's kind of interesting to get to be the same people who are doing both of those things. It's like, wow, like times have really changed when people are giving us all these kudos for, and it's not even a grant. I mean, it's an investment in a company. So it's not as like, charitable. But people are just ready for something really different now. So it's been great to launch that program and have it running. And we'll see what happens there. A few of our Invisible College folks who were like kind of like pre when we called it that have moved on to our 250K checks are now like fully fledged portfolio companies. And some of our, we just call it the IC, some of our IC people are going to be sort of coming up on potentially needing more funding, and we'll make more determinations. But it's been great to have another offering for people.
Got it. So now I want to sort of look back at like all of the work you've done, and I'm curious, how did the Thiel Fellowship and your work at Innovations Academy, as well as a tutor, as well as the work that you've really done over the past 5-ish years with 1517, how has that contributed to your like current day thesis of how to invest at 1517?
That's a great question. For us, I think for us, it really comes back to people. That is something that has been very strong that we've just seen over the life of, really my whole career. I mean, I used to do things like intelligence testing as well, and working one-on-one with people, and then the tutoring, and then working with founders, working with the people at my school. Like it was all sort of looking at certain attributes of people. How do they adapt? How do they learn? Do they have certain traits we look for? One trait that we look for a lot, and we've coined our own term for this, is hyperfluency. Can someone talk backwards and forwards in a space ad nauseum, and you can just tell they're really into it? I'm someone who gets very excited about other people's excitement. And so when a founder comes in and is just like a diehard about something, I'm like, yeah, that's the type of person that we're looking for. And I think we have learned with 1517 to keep going with that sort of gut sense that we have about someone else. But what we've had to learn is how do we match that up with sort of the market and what's happening economically in the world. One thing I've told people about running 1517 is that we have to just be much more plugged into what's going on socially, politically, economically than when we were at the foundation. When we were at the foundation, we were kind of sheltered. We didn't have to think about global macro and what's happening. And I thought, because we were a pre-seed fund 5 years ago, I thought that, oh, well, we're a pre-seed fund, and because we're like the small fry, we must be like in a sheltered harbor of sorts. No, it just means we feel the tsunami way more. We're like, oh God, like here's what it looks like when capital controls happen. Like, oh, we have no funding from these countries anymore. Like that's a really big deal for a small fund. Or for example, our companies, Chinese New Year's coming up, manufacturing shuts down, everything shuts down for a month, and our companies have had to learn, and we've had to learn the hard way of, oh, okay, here's how you prep for that. So we're just much more plugged in than we used to be, I think, in a lot of different ways. So there's been some things that we've held on to from our past about working with people and seeing patterns and founders that we've worked with and what works and what doesn't. But then there's been a ton of learning, and there's a constant being on your toes on what's happening in the world. What are the things that we need to be aware of to be able to be good fund managers, not only for our LPs, but also our companies. What we tell our companies is that we're not here to be experts in their company. We're here to be experts in the market of startups and what's happening. Like when a company comes to us and says, I'm going to raise my seed round or my Series A round, I need to be able to inform them, here's what's going on in those markets. Because if they're not prepared, they'll spend a lot of time, money, and energy doing something they shouldn't be spending any time on at all. But that means I need to be able to inform them of that.
Got it. And so to boil down all the stuff we've talked about today, I'm curious, what is like one thing that you wish you had known when you were first starting your time at the Thiel Fellowship, Innovations Academy, 1517, any of those?
Oh gosh, what's one thing I would have? that sort of ties them all together?
Yeah. Or like just one in general.
That's a good question. I'm gonna try to tie them together. Let's see what happens. Um, hmm. Hmm. There's something percolating. Hmm. Okay, I guess what comes to mind is like really sticking hard with your mission and vision is really important. And one of the learnings on every single one of these is that there's a lot of pain that you go through visioning something in your mind and what it's going to be like, and then like the reality of what it's like and the delta between those things. It's really hard. Like when we started the school, we had our big vision of like, children are going to be up at the top of Maslow's hierarchy and we're going to be doing all these amazing enrichment things. And then like the population of students we worked with needed food. Like they did, they weren't getting nutrition and things like that. And we were like, okay, delta, they need food. We want them to be self-actualized. Okay, we need to get them food. And then we can like start shoring that up and bringing it to here. And it's the same thing with anything else I've done. Like with the fellowship, we thought like, oh, okay, these people, like all of them are going to be totally self-motivated and just doing their thing. And it's like, no, a lot of people don't know how to be self-motivated. And when you give them a pile of resources, they don't know how to start getting going with it because they've never had that opportunity before. Or with our companies, there's the thing they pitch you on, like, we're going here, we're going to do this thing. And then it's like, we're 3 people and, we barely have enough funding to do anything, but we need to figure out what we're going to do on Friday to get there. And so I think it's just this sense of knowing that delta is always going to exist and what are the steps you can take to shore up the delta while keeping the mission in mind and moving towards it, instead of saying, oh, we're going to like minimize our mission so that it's closer to reality. No, that's not what you do. You have to push it in the direction of the mission, but you also can't be delusional that reality doesn't exist.
Got it. And so I want to end the podcast with a question that I ask all of my guests, which is, what is your favorite number and what is the significance behind that number?
Oh, that's funny. That's funny. I'm simple. I like the number 4. It's stable. Yeah, I don't know. To me, 4 is just a good, stable number. I've always liked it. I've always liked drawing things like cubes. So I'm sticking with that one.
Got it. All right. Thanks for answering that question. I think that brings us to a nice close.
Yeah.
Yes. So I wanted to thank you so much again for coming on the podcast. I really had a great time recording with you.
No, I had so much fun. This is like one of the best ones I've done in a long time. I can't wait to send it out to people.